exciting and amazing. Only a preacher can make it dull. So hopefully we won't do that. And we'll get some good stuff. We will take 2 weeks to look at Daniel. So tonight, we'll look at the book. We're going to look at the breakdown of the chapters and what the book is actually about. And then next week, we'll look at the visions, and we'll look at the different prophecies that Daniel is laying out and what they mean to some degree. It's not going to be a prophecy course, but, just again, the 30,000 foot at the prophecies that Daniel had. But to try to squeeze them all in 1 week, one book, 1 hour kind of thing, it just won't fit. So we'll take 2 weeks on Daniel. Again, this week, we'll just kind of go through the whole book. Next week, we'll look at some of the prophecies.
Did I understand you to say that only a preacher can make it dull?
Yeah.
You realize you're a preacher, though.
Yeah, I do. That's why I was saying I'm asking for forgiveness before I even get started. So, all right.
You don't make it dull.
Well, I hope not. All right. So let's talk about Daniel. And for some that are new here, we've been going through the Bible. We started in Genesis, and the Bible is not set up chronologically. And we've been going through the Bible chronologically, and we've been looking at some of the old or minor prophets before we've gotten to Daniel, because they actually fall in line chronologically before Daniel. So now we're at Daniel, and we are in the Babylonian captivity from a historical standpoint. And so that's kind of where we are in our study and kind of the way that we've been approaching this. So let's just get into our outline, as we've been doing every time. The author, of course, is Daniel, right. So all the prophets, the name of the book is actually the author of the book, except for Lamentations. Lamentations is written by Jeremiah, which we've already gone through all that. So a couple of verses to back this up. Daniel chapter 7 and verse 1 says, "In the first year of Belshazzar, the king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream and visions of his head upon his pillow," or in other words, when he was sleeping. "Then he wrote the dream and told the sum of the matters." So what we see in Daniel is we see what he has dreamed and visions that he's had, as well as some historical things that are there. Also, there's this first person narrative. So many places within the book of Daniel, you see I, Daniel. So it's referring to Daniel as he's writing them, and the references I've put there for you. Here's an example, Daniel chapter 7 and verse 15. "I, Daniel, was grieved in my spirit in the midst of my body, and the vision of my head troubled me." Okay? So it's very personal as he's writing this. It's coming from his heart, from his standpoint as he's writing this. And then Jesus confirms that Daniel's the author. Anybody got an idea of what verse that I'm referring to or thinking about? Well, you've got it in your notes. You're already looking. All right, so you're cheating on me. All right, Matthew chapter 24 and verse 15. "When ye therefore see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet." So I'm kind of thinking if Jesus is verifying that Daniel wrote the book of Daniel, I'm good with that, right? So there are some that are trying to kick things around and say Daniel didn't write it, so on and so forth. But majority of people and tradition says that Daniel was certainly the author of the book. So Daniel is to the Old Testament what Revelation is to the New Testament. So Daniel is that prophecy book of future times, things that are going to be taking place, as we look at Revelation as that book that is talking about future prophetical things that are going to be taking place down the road. In general, the book is written in 2 parts. Chapters 1 through 6 is biographical and stories of people and events. So the first 6 chapters in general, are basically about people and events. Okay, and we'll walk through all that. Chapters 7 through 12 are series of prophecies and visions. Now, there's prophecies and visions in chapter 2, which is the statue. And then you also have some stories in the later chapters. But in a general sense, you can break it up into those 2 particular things, biographical and stories, and prophecies and visions. The contents of the book represent future events for Daniel. So as you think about that, everything that Daniel is writing about is what's coming. The only thing that would be the exception would be where Daniel is talking about Babylon and the kingdom of Babylon. So that would be his present time, okay? But everything else is future. Some of these have become historical from our perspective, while others are still future events. So some of the things in the book of Daniel have actually come to be and have happened. And there's other things in the book of Daniel that are still to come, okay? And we'll see some of those things as we go through that, right? I don't know if you knew this, but the book of Daniel is written in 2 languages. Anybody know that, or is that new to you? Did you know that? Okay, some did, some didn't. All right, so it's actually written in 2 different languages. Obviously, Hebrew is one. So chapters 1, verse 1 through chapters 2, verse 4, and then chapters 8 through 12 are written in Hebrew. Chapters 2 through chapter 2, 5, 7, and 20 through 7:28 is written in Aramaic, which explains, I'll talk to you in a little bit, the book of Daniel is not in a chronological order either. So we'll see that as we walk through this, through the book. All right, the book is not written chronologically, which I just stated, just to fill in that blank. Through the book of Daniel, Daniel lives through 4 major leaders with 2 different kingdoms. So in the lifespan of Daniel, there's 4 major leaders. Now remember, they don't change leaders every 4 years like we do, right? Their kings would be there for ages. So there were 4 leaders that he was under in 2 different kingdoms. And Daniel served God for over 80 years. He was an old timer. All right, so let's take a look at the timeline here and see how all that kind of comes together and plays out. So the 4 different leaders that are there that Daniel was living under and prophesied under, you have Nebuchadnezzar, and that's chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4, and that was in Babylon. So chapter 1 is Pagan U. That's just a quick summary of what's going on there. They send Daniel and his 3 comrades to Pagan U to convert them to paganism, all right? Chapter 2, you've got the statue. You've got chapter 3, the fiery furnace. We know those stories. And then chapter 4 is the tree about Nebuchadnezzar being the wild animal, okay? Then we have Belshazzar. And that is chapter 7, 8, and 5. And again, that is in Babylon. And you have the 4 beasts in the prophecy in chapter 7. You have the ram and goat in the prophecy in chapter 8, and the handwriting on the wall under chapter 5. And I know you're going, why is chapter 5 down here and where's chapter 6? Right? That was popped right out in your mind. Okay. Well, I'll explain that in a little while. All right. So Darius, and of course, he was Persia, Medo-Persia. The chapters are, here's your chapter 6, which is the lion's den. Then you have chapter 9, the 70 weeks. And then you have chapters 11 and 12, which is the conflict that's coming. And this will be as clear as mud here in a minute, okay? Why these chapters are all messed up. But like I said, it's not written chronologically, all right? And then you have Cyrus, and that is chapter 10, and again in Persia, and that's the delayed vision. So as we actually look at the book of Daniel, and because it's not written chronologically, chapter 10 is really the last chapter that was written. But again, because it's written in the different languages, they compiled them all together. So you have Hebrew, and Aramaic in the middle. Okay? All right. So the dates are 607 to 536 BC. That's the time frame of Daniel and what we know when he was prophesying. So, as you recall the timeline now, just to kind of go back and just refresh your memory, because you had three of these guys, these prophets, who were there at the same time and contemporaries of one another. So Jeremiah, the last that we really heard from Jeremiah was around 580 BC, and he was in Jerusalem and in Egypt. He finally went to Egypt. He was forced to Egypt, and there we talked a couple weeks ago about Jeremiah, that he was probably stoned. We really don't know. There in Egypt, that's where he died. That's what tradition says, okay? Also, you have Ezekiel, and kind of the last we heard from Ezekiel is about 570 BC, and he was on the outskirts of Babylon. So he was taken captive in the second captivity, and he was by the river Chebar, which is really more of an irrigation canal coming off the Tigris and Euphrates River. So that was where he kind of was located when he was doing his prophecy. He was prophesying there in Babylon, prophesying to the people there in captivity. And then you have Daniel. So Daniel, the last we kind of hear from him is 536 BC, and of course, he is in Babylon. So when you look at these three, they're all living at the same time, contemporaries of each other, and they're all prophesying, but each having a different ministry, a different aspect where God is having them appeal and approach to his own people. All right, let's look at the timeline here at Daniel. So we have 605 BC to 536 BC. Okay, so there's some blanks there. Hopefully we'll go slow enough you'll be able to get those in. So we're going to look at the chapter arrangements chronologically and the age of Daniel as the chapters unfold. Okay, so instead of chapters 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, we're going to actually put it in the chronological order and the dates in which they fell. Okay, so here's the actual chapters in the order in which they were written. So you have chapters 1, 2, 3, 4, chapter 7, chapter 8, chapter 5, chapter 9, then chapter 6, 11, 12, and then 10. Follow? You're not confused yet? Okay. We'll give it a minute, all right? We'll make you really confused. All right. So there's some dates in Daniel that we actually know, because Daniel will say in the 12th year of so-and-so's reign, and so on and so forth. So there's some specific dates that we actually know. So the first date is 556 BC. The second date is 553 BC. Another date is 550 BC. And then 539 BC. So those are hard dates that we actually know and understand from Daniel's writing. Okay? So, when we start looking at when did each of these stories, visions, chapters unfold in the book of Daniel, when did they happen within this period of time? You're looking at chapters 1 through 4, coming here very early. So I'll let you kind of draw some arrows, and you can point here. We'll have some other arrows pointing, okay? All right. So that was early in Daniel's life. So we have young Daniel at age 15 when he was taken into captivity. So he in this early part of his life. So we have the story of Pagan U, right, where they took him and they changed their name and they tried to change their diet and all that stuff that went on when they first took him to Babylon. Okay, all right. Chapter 7 was written in 556 BC. Then chapter 8 was written in 553 BC. Chapter 5 in 550 BC. And chapter 9 in 550 BC. Okay, you getting it? because I know I'm making you work. But I want to keep you awake. You're tired, I know. All right. So we get to this area in Daniel's life. It's 50 years later, and Daniel's about 60 years old. So we've got a few years now that has separated chapters 1 through 4 and the rest of the book. So there's roughly, 30 years? Okay? And in that period of time where we've really, there's nothing that we know other than the fact that we know Daniel was put in a position of authority in Babylon and he was doing his thing there. Okay? So that is that section. Chapter 6, 11, and 12 were written around 539 BC. And then, of course, chapter 10 around 536 BC, about 3 years later. And, of course, this is about 20 years later, and Daniel's in his 80s when he's writing that. Now, when you look at the book of Daniel, you don't really realize that, right? You just see these things and you just think they're just clipping along and they're just stories written one after another and the visions. And, you don't realize this period of time that is between some of these chapters and the visions and the things that are going on. And in the meanwhile, Daniel is doing his thing. So if you recall about the book of Daniel, and probably most of us know the general stories of Daniel and so on and so forth, but we know how good of a reputation Daniel had, right? And how he was moved up into the ranks of the government. Well, that's where he's spending his time building his reputation in here. Okay? There's a lot of application we can make there, but we don't have time for that. We're at 30,000 foot, right? So, all right. So let's look at the chart a little bit and the breakdown of the book. So we have chapter 1, like I said, is more historical and stories. So you have the history of Daniel. You've got his personal life. And then, of course, you also have the 3 Hebrew children, as it's referred to. You got Daniel's background, and this is written in Hebrew. And then you get in chapter 2 through chapter 7, you see the visions of Nebuchadnezzar, the vision of Belshazzar, the decree of Darius, and the 4 beasts. These are Daniel's interprets other dreams, written in Aramaic. Then you have the prophecy or prophetical plan of Israel, the vision of the ram and he-goat, the vision of 70 weeks, and the vision of Israel's future. So the book actually does break down pretty well from following it and understanding it. It's not nearly as complicated as people like to make it, but having that breakdown and understanding helps make sense, when you're trying to get through that. The place is obviously in Babylon and Persia. And again, we've got the time frame there. And then you've got written in Aramaic and then written in Hebrew. So let's do a breakdown on the chapters. And like I said, we know the stories in general. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the stories. I'll pull some application because there's some things you just can't ignore. But in general, we'll just kind of run down what each chapter is basically all about. So remember, in the first 6 chapters is more biographical and stories that are told. So we're introduced to Daniel and his 3 colleagues. They were sent to Pagan U, as we're calling it. So they sent them to their training, to their schools, and the idea behind that was to assimilate them into the Babylonian culture. So if you remember, Nebuchadnezzar told them, get the brightest of the young men and bring them in. So they brought them in at the young age, and then they're going to try to convert them into this paganistic belief system. Okay? They changed their names in chapter 1. So you had Daniel his name was changed to Belshazzar. Then you have Hananiah was changed to Shadrach. Mishael was Meshach. Azariah was Abednego. I heard one preacher, and I don't know the right pronunciation, but I heard one preacher say it was Abednego. That's the way he pronounced that. So I've always heard Abednego, so we'll stick with that one, okay? All right. So they are put into their training and school for the purpose of assimilating them into the Babylonian culture. The first thing they did was change their names. I'm not going to take time to go into what all these names mean, but these are related to their pagan gods. Like most names are related, even with the names that were given to them. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that's not the name, their Hebrew name. Their Hebrew name is Hannah, Mishael, and Azariah. Okay? So here's the verse. Chapter 1, verse 6. Now among these were the children of Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, unto whom the prince of the eunuchs gave names. For he gave unto Daniel the name of Belteshazzar, and to Hananiah, Shadrach, and to Mishael, Meshach, and to Azariah of Abednego. Okay? So the scripture is teaching us how they went in and changed their name. Then they went in and changed their diet. And you probably recall that. They went in and said, hey, dude, we really don't partake of that food. It's against our belief system. Give us a trial period. And if we're not any better, then fine. Then we'll do what you want us to do. But if we're better, then hooray, all's good. So he agreed to it. And of course, at the end of that period of time, they were all great, right? There was no issues or no problems. So, but all of this was in place to kind of brainwash them into this pagan culture that they were involved in. Note, they were put under a strategic, planned strategy to change their identity through education, dietary habits, and their names to pour the pagan culture into them, which is in violation of what the Jewish culture taught them. Now, just by application, okay? What do you think our current system does? We have our kids, we put them in Christian schools, we homeschool them and everything else, and then we send them out to a government school, and they come back a different person, right? They come back totally different because they've been exposed to the paganism that's out there, and they actually brainwash them in all that. Not much has changed, right? So if you want to do that, you start in the schools, and that's what communism says. Communism says get them in the school, get them while they're young, teach them when they're young, right? So that same kind of culture is working in today. But Romans chapter 12 and verse 2 says, be not conformed to this world. Why do you think it says be not conformed to this world? Because the world is the problem, right? So don't be conformed to that world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. And that's what Daniel and his three friends were doing. They were not allowing the world to push them into its mold. They were swimming upstream in a downstream river, and they knew God's word. They knew what God expected. And even with their food, they said, no, that's not what we should be doing. That's not the kind of food that we should be eating. Can we make a deal with you? Right? And it's interesting to see in that their strategy, because they didn't protest. They didn't go on hunger strikes. They just came and said, hey, this is a different culture, and we're just not used to this, and we don't want to partake of this. Can we make a deal, work out something with you? And they did it through just a strategy of just compromise and, hey, let's make a deal, right? So a very wise way in which for them to approach this. All right, so chapter 2 then brings us to Nebuchadnezzar's dream of the great image, okay? And we'll spend a lot of time on that next week. We'll talk more about that. So in verses 1 through 15, the challenge to interpret the dream without giving any details, Okay? So if you remember the story, Nebuchadnezzar has this dream, and there's a statue, head of gold, and the brass, and the clay, and the iron, and all that. He saw that statue. And then he got up in the morning, he went to his people and said, hey, I need you to interpret the dream, but I'm not going to tell you what it was. You got to tell me what it was. And it's interesting, why would he do that? Because he couldn't trust his people. Because if I tell you what it is, then it's easy for you to give me an interpretation for it. So I'm going to test you and make sure you're really loyal to me and really are a seer, a prophet, and you tell me what I dreamt, and then I'll tell you if you're right or wrong on the vision. Well, of course, they come back and say, well, there's no way we can do that. You got to tell us what it is. How can we do that? There's no man that can do that. Well, they're right. There is no man to do that. So who did they call on? They called on Daniel, because they heard about Daniel, and they heard that he was a spiritual man, and they said, he can do this, right? So they called Daniel, and Daniel goes in before the Nebuchadnezzar, and he says, hey, yeah, give me 24 hours. So what did Daniel do then? Daniel went back to his three friends, and he called a prayer meeting. And they prayed all night. And they prayed, and they prayed, and they prayed. And then Daniel came back with the interpretation and the message of the dream. So we'll talk about that statue next week and what each of those things are and how they've played out and what those are all pointing to. All right, chapter 3, Nebuchadnezzar misunderstands now this dream. And about 20 years later, from that dream that he had, he builds the golden statue of himself and demands that everyone worships him. Because he's the head of gold, right? Well, he misunderstood that. He misunderstood that that's only for a period of time. There's another kingdom that's going to come in. They're going to wipe you out. But, he took that to be, hey, I'm like God. I'm the gold. I'm a statue. He makes the statue of himself, and then he orders everybody to bow down and worship the statue, right? Not bowing down to the image brings consequence of the fiery furnace. Okay? And again, we know all that. What's interesting is we don't see Daniel around here or involved in this, and he wasn't thrown into the fiery furnace. Where was Daniel? Did he cave? I know you're going, I don't think so. I don't think he would do that, but yeah, what about that? Well, he wasn't there. He was off on a mission somewhere for the king. He was not in the location where this was unfolding, which was not in Babylon itself. So he wasn't even there. He didn't even have to make the decision because he wasn't there. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were, right? So they refused to bow down. And what happened? They got thrown into the fiery furnace. There we see the pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus himself. Okay? Shows up as the fourth man in the fire. All right, chapter 4. Nebuchadnezzar dreams of the tree being chopped down. For 7 years, he loses his position, was insane, and lived like an animal. God once again is messaging Nebuchadnezzar that his kingdom will not last, to humble himself. That was the purpose of that. So he'd build a statue to himself. He had ordered these people to worship him. He was willing to kill them if they didn't worship him. Now he's bringing this upon him, this tree, as a picture, showing him that he's going to lose his position, and for 7 years he'll live like an animal. At the end, he did exalt and honor God as God. So Daniel chapter 4 and verse 37 says, "Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, all whose works are true, and his ways judgment. And those that walk in pride, he is able to abase," or he's able to humble. It's interesting, couple of things here. The question comes, did Nebuchadnezzar get saved? I know that's a New Testament term, right? But I mean, did he get converted in that? Well, some scholars say he did. Some scholars say he didn't. I guess we'll have to wait till we get to heaven to see if Nebuchadnezzar's there. All right. But there's a shot. Maybe he got to a place where he was humbled enough that he recognized God as God. I don't know. We'll have to see. And then interesting, it was for a specific period of time. How many years? 7. When all the kingdoms are going to be under the authority of a crazy man, right? And in this story, it unpacks the fact that God is in control of all nations. And at the end of the tribulation period, which just happens to be 7 years, God is going to take it all away and start fresh, right? So that is actually a picture of the tribulation period if you get into the details of it. All right. Chapter 5. Again, we're still looking at some of the stories there. We get to Belshazzar and the handwriting on the wall. And again, that's one of those favorite kid stories that we tell in Sunday school and our junior churches and all that stuff that we do. What they were doing was defiling the furnishings while drinking and worshiping the gods of Baal. So as you remember the story, he called a party and they were all partying and drinking, and they went in. All the temple that was raided and destroyed, remember in the third event that took place, they took all those things, they brought them in, and they took all those furnishings and they brought them out, and they began to use the vessels and stuff and party with them and drink from them and worshiping their own God, defiling God through all these goblets and everything. And then it says the candlestick was standing there, and right above the candlestick is where the hand was writing what it wrote. While the party's going on, God sends the message to Belshazzar, the kingdom is going to fall. And it says, Mene, Mene, Telke, Upharsin, was the message that was written. And once again, nobody can interpret that. So Belshazzar calls his seers in and tells them to tell him what the meaning is. Nobody has any idea what it is. They can't tell him what it means. So his wife says, hey, I know a guy, Daniel, and the Spirit of God is with him. And so you should call him in and you should ask him what this message is. Because he was bribing everybody, say, hey, if you'll just tell me what this means, I'll put a purple robe on you, give you jewelry, make you third in command, and blah, blah, blah. You know, all this reward for telling him what the message means. So they go and they get Daniel. He comes in and he interprets it. And as he begins to interpret it, he tells the king to keep all that stuff. I don't need that mess. Because he knew what was coming down. Because it wasn't going to matter anyway, right? All right, so the interpretation is God has numbered your kingdom and finished it. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. In other words, God's looked at you and weighed it all out and tilt. You know, the good, evil versus bad thing, I mean, it's not even close. Okay? And then you have Paris. Your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. You know, it's interesting on this, the examples that really begin to come out and the applications that you can make. Genesis chapter 6 and verse 7, be not deceived. God is not mocked. Whatsoever man soweth, that shall he also reap. So, while the party's going on, he's getting the interpretation. The enemy is attacking the city outside. So while this party is happening, while they're defiling God, and while Daniel is standing there giving him the interpretation, they're outside getting into the castle and getting inside the gate and taking over the city. Now, you would think, if somebody was attacking my castle, I wouldn't be throwing a party, right? But that's how corrupt the guy actually was. And this was actually later in Daniel's life when he was about 60 years of age. Right? Chapter 6 is the lion's den. The problem is praying daily. And again, everybody knows the story pretty well. So what's happening here, and see if you can relate with this currently in today in application. The law is moved, and it appears that Daniel is the troublemaker for practicing what was lawful the week before. I mean, all this time for the last 60 years plus, it's not been a problem to pray. All of a sudden, they changed the law, and now he's a problem, right? And that's what's happening in our culture. When the government moves from taking care of the roads, the borders, teaching math, to redefining marriage, erasing gender, and redefining infant murder as women's health, it creates what looks like, for believers, a rebellious group of people. We look rebellious, right? 50 years ago, that was never a problem. That wasn't an issue. You've come in and you've changed everything. And you're telling us that we're wrong, right? So we're faced with the same problems that Daniel was faced with. And in our culture today, no real change in any of that. All right, chapter 7 now moves us more to prophecies and visions. So we have Daniel's dreams and visions began there. We have the 4 beasts. So you have the lion with the wings of eagles, with an eagle. You have a bear with 3 ribs in his mouth. And we'll talk more about that next week. Get into those details. You have a leper with 4 wings and 4 heads. Then you have a beast that was dreadful and terrible and exceedingly strong. Does that sound remotely familiar to any kind of beast that's described in the Bible? Well, that's next week. Okay. So these 4 beasts, the lion, the bear, the leper, and the beast, are in a vision. Also in chapter 7, we have the vision of the Ancient of Days, which we talked a little bit last week. You remember we talked about the Ancient of Days and God on his throne. In chapter 8, we have Daniel's vision of the ram with the 2 horns and the he-goat. So we'll talk a little bit more about that next week. Chapter 9, reading the prophecy of Jeremiah and his words of 70 years of captivity. Here's what's significant about that. Now, we talked about this when we were in Jeremiah, that Daniel had actually read what Jeremiah wrote about the prophecy of 70 years that they would be in captivity. We are in like year 68 of captivity when he's reading this. And Daniel begins to just pour his heart out, and we'll see that here in a second, but not to get too far ahead of myself. He begins to pour this out because he looks around and he says, nobody's ready. We knew it was going to be 70 years. Jeremiah told us it's going to be 70, and nobody's ready. It's like, surprise. Oh, we're here already? And I relate that to the fact because when we get into the 70 weeks, God's told us exactly what we need to know about his coming. And the Jews, we'll unpack that next week, the day he rode into Jerusalem was foretold in the 70 weeks. And they're like, surprise, we didn't know. It's like, duh. You know, I told you, you know, and I look at the end times in our times, and I think the same thing. Because we know exactly not the day, right? But we know the season and the times. And we know that we're in those times now. And if we're not ready, if we don't understand where we are, the men of Issachar understood where they were, and it told them what they needed to do. And we need to be wise like that. We need to know where we are in God's prophetical timeline to know how we should be behaving as believers. So Daniel's prayer and confession of his own sins and the sins of the nation. So Daniel gets on his knees before God here in chapter 9. He just pours his heart out to God about his own sin. He pours his heart about how Israel has sinned against him and how they have so messed things up. You've got the 70 weeks of years, the 490 years, which I was alluding to here just a few minutes ago, which again we'll unpack next week. You have the time when Messiah will show up. Know exactly when he was going to show up. Daniel prophesied it. And it just right over their heads, right? And will the Jews receive or reject Messiah? Because in the prophecy, he says Messiah will be cut off. Right? He was crucified. Okay? All right. Chapter 10. We get into the chronological perspective. Chapter 10 is the last chapter of Daniel. So kind of keep this in mind. So this was the last chapter that Daniel would have written. He's written all the other chapters prior to this. And notice how Daniel kind of is putting his thoughts together as he writes technically the last chapter. The messenger, this is that section where the messenger is held up from answering Daniel's prayer for 21 days. By the prince of Persia. You remember he prays and he's waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting for an answer. And he's the messenger is held up for 21 days. And the messenger, Gabriel, comes and he says, hey, we were held up and we are in a spiritual battle and we are fighting against a spiritual kingdom. Even the angels are engaged in this battle. This is Daniel's thinking in that last chapter, technically, chronologically, not the way it's laid out in the book. He's given all this information about all these prophecies, and he's saying, here's what's going on, and you have to understand this is a spiritual battle that's taking place. It's spiritual. It's not physical. It's not something that we can fight with the physicalness of it. With all the future prophecy written in Daniel, God is making sure that we understand the battle is a spiritual battle, not a physical one. You know the verses popping in your mind, right? Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 12. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood. And yet we act like that all the time. We make it a physical battle instead of getting on our knees before God. We should be spending a lot more time praying. Probably as a church, we should be spending a lot more time praying. A preacher that I follow, it's a mega church, but they have Wednesday night prayer meeting. And he was getting to the church and he said he had people at the church praying for the prayer meeting. That's the kind of church we need to be. But I guarantee if we called a prayer meeting, well, all right. So, for we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. So there's this reminder in chapter 10 of the spiritual battle that we're all facing every day in our lives. And my challenge to us is we're just not praying enough and recognizing the spiritual battle that's going on. Whether it's Washington, D.C., whether it's our own personal lives, whether it's the guy or gal at work, it's a spiritual battle. It's all about a spiritual battle. Chapter 11, we get into continued future prophecies of the kingdoms. You have Persia and you have Greece with Alexander the Great. We get into the last days and we actually get into a description of the Antichrist. Did you know there was a description of the Antichrist in there? Let's unpack that a little bit. Daniel chapter 11 and verse 36. And the king shall do according, this is talking about the Antichrist, and the king shall do according to his will. And he shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak marvelous things against the God of gods, and shall prosper till the indignation be accomplished. For that is the determination, for that is determined shall be done. Neither shall he regard the God of his fathers, nor the desires of women, nor regard any God, for he shall magnify himself. So let's look at the description and the characteristics of the Antichrist. He will do according to his will. Now, as we go through these, see if it doesn't ring some bells in your head. Okay, I hope it does. He will exalt himself. He will magnify himself above every god. I'll slow down just a little bit. He will speak against the God of gods. He will disregard the God of his fathers. So in other words, it would be realistic to believe he's a Jew. He will disregard the desires of women, which it's reasonable to assume he's a homosexual. Now, that's an opinion, right? Not going to the bank on that. It's an opinion. But he will disregard the desire of women. And he will disregard the need of any god. And he will magnify himself above all. Okay? So that's a description of the Antichrist. So if you're looking to see who that person is, just look at these characteristics. Okay? So here in Isaiah chapter 12, see if this doesn't sound familiar to you and relate to somebody that you know. How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? How art thou cut down to the ground, which didst waken the nations? For thou hast said in thine heart, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars. I will sit upon the mount of the congregation in the sides of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High God, or like the Most High. Does that sound like the power behind the Antichrist? Right. All right, chapter 12. You have the Great Tribulation and the end times as Daniel is talking about those events that are coming up. In chapter 12 and verse 1, it says this, and at that time shall Michael stand up, the great prince which standeth for the children of your people. And there shall be a time of trouble. This is a reference to the tribulation period. Such as never was seen since there was a nation, even to that same time. And that time your people shall be delivered. And at that time your people shall be delivered, every one that shall be found written in the book. Have you ever heard of a book? Okay. And many of them that sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, and some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting content. And they that be wise shall shine as the brightness of the firmament, and they that turn many to righteousness as the stars forever and ever. Okay, here's that challenge, like we were talking last week about warning people, right? And if you're not warning people, the blood is on your hands. All right? So Daniel doesn't understand this and asks for clarification, but was told, not now. I'm not going to clarify this for you right now. So he's reading all this. He's going, man, I don't know. This is making my head swim. I'm not getting it. And he was responding. God said, not now. I'm not telling you now. So watch this. In verse 6, and the one said to the man clothed in linen, which was upon the waters of the river, how long shall it be to the end of these wonders? So how long is this going to be before all of that unfolds? And I heard the man clothed in the linen, which was upon the waters of the river, when he held up his right hand and his left hand unto heaven, and swear by him that the living forever, that it shall be for a time, times and a half. This is a direct reference to the great tribulation in the last 3.5 years. And when he shall have accomplished to the scattered the power of the holy people, all these things shall be finished. So if you recall enough from your prophecy and understanding, at the end of the tribulation period, everybody's wiped out. We go into the millennial period, right? So he's saying that at the end of that last 3.5 years, that's when Satan is going to have full power to just blast everything, right? And at the end of that time period, that will be the end. That will be when it is finished. The signs of the end times: people shall run to and fro. Travel will increase. Knowledge will increase. And then Daniel was given the instruction to seal up the book. The book is sealed until the time of the end, in verse 9. So what that is saying is all this that's going on, it's not going to be understood until those days get there. When those days get there, you're going to be able to understand all this. First off, we have history. So when we talk about these kingdoms that are going to come and fall and come and fall and come and fall, we have history to rely on. We can see all of that, right? We can see those things. So in the latter days, all of this is being revealed and is being opened, and our eyes are able to see what Daniel is all about. Okay? All right, so let's make a couple of brief applications as we finish up tonight. So certainly with Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, your circumstances should never determine your level of loyalty and devotion to God. Our circumstances, whatever we're in, whatever stage of life we're in, whatever we're going through, should never, ever affect our loyalty and devotion to God. God should always be first, no matter what's going on. And if we're going through the midst of the fiery furnace, we trust God through that. I don't know why, God. I don't understand. Man, I've done everything right. I just don't get it. Job never knew why he went through the trials he went through. Never learned it. But he stayed faithful. Right? So our circumstances, whatever we're going through, should never determine our loyalty or devotion. We are to be salt and light and salt in the world. Daniel's testimony, every time there was a dream, go get Daniel. He's got the Holy Spirit with him. People knew where to go when they had no answers. Courage to stand when asked to compromise your stance. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They weren't going to bow down. They stood. And they were cast into the fire. Ever since Cain and Abel, the wicked have hated righteousness, choosing to obey God rather than men. Daniel 6:10 and Acts 5:29. So Daniel 6:10 is this. Now, when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, so this was when he was going to go to the lion's den, and he was told no longer to pray, when it was okay yesterday. But all of a sudden, now it's a law. And the king wrote the law, put his signature on it. So when Daniel knew that he knew it was written. He knew that it was signed. He knew that it was a law. What did he do? He went into his house, and his window being open in his chambers towards Jerusalem, he kneeled upon his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God as he did aforetime. I'm not changing who I am. Just because you change your laws doesn't change who I am. And then, of course, Acts chapter 5 and verse 29, then Peter and the other apostles answered and said, we ought to obey God rather than men. Amen to that, right? Easily said. What would we do if we were faced with the lion's den or the fiery furnace? How would we react, right? Hopefully we would all do the same thing. There appeared to be only 3 that would not fall down and worship that statue of Nebuchadnezzar. Yeah.
Can you give us an example of being salt as a Christian? I understand the light, but what else?
Salt is a flavoring that gives seasoning to food. So to be a salt would be someone who is, I would go back to chapter 1 when they were being told that they needed to change their names and change their diets, and they made a deal with them. So the salt would be the tact and the sensitivity of being able to work in a situation so that it's not coarse or ends up being a thrown in jail. You know, I'm just trying to think off the top of my head. So it's a seasoning that gives flavor to something rather than a dramatic, rebellious attitude towards a situation. So, yes. So and pleasant, right? A preservative, yes. Mm-hmm. Yes.
And salt also makes us thirsty, so our lives should reflect such that people will be thirsty.
Excellent. Yeah, I like yours better than mine. Good. All right. So that's just the breakdown of the book. So next week we'll get into some fun stuff with the prophecies. Again, it's not going to be a prophetical course. It's just going to be looking at the different things and what they break down to and what they mean. And then we can look at it obviously historically and say these events have happened already and here's the ones that are still to come. Okay? All right. Father, thank you for our time tonight. And as we have gotten into the book of Daniel, and just looked at this book just from that 30,000 foot perspective, but so many lessons to learn from the people in this book. And Lord, your servant Daniel and how faithful he was, and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and how they were willing to stand in evil times. God, may we be those kind of people. We may not be called to give our life, but we may be called and have to have serious challenges going forward. We may lose something. We may have to give up something. There may be rights that we have to lose in the future. So Lord, I just pray that our hearts and our beings and our relationship with you is so strong that we will obey you no matter what man says. So Lord, I just pray that you challenge our hearts in these areas. And Lord, just go with us through the rest of this week and help us to be the salt and the light in our world. In Jesus' name.
Not one stone